The Last Cell. Part 1: The Arrival. Henry Mallister had always been drawn to the darker corners of the world. An investigative journalist by trade, he had spent the last decade exposing the hidden truths of society's most dangerous institutions, corrupt governments, oppressive regimes, and most recently, the criminal justice system. But none of these had prepared him for the hell he was about to step into. The Old Stone Penitentiary had long been a legend in the criminal underworld. Built in the late 1800s, it stood isolated on a craggy hill, its iron gates and towering stone walls a reminder of a bygone era. But despite its decrepit condition, Old Stone's reputation had endured. It was a place where the worst of the worst were sent, where no man, no matter how vile, ever escaped. And now, Henry was about to get a first-hand look inside. He had received an anonymous tip, one that promised answers to the disturbing rumors about the prison's operations. Whispers had circulated for years about inmates who vanished without a trace, guards who spoke in hushed tones about strange happenings behind the prison walls, and unexplained lights flickering in the dead of night. Everyone had written it off as nothing more than ghost stories. But Henry wasn't one for superstition. He'd come to uncover the truth. The prison itself seemed to pulse with a foreboding energy as Henry made his way toward the main entrance. His boots crunched on the gravel path, the sound deafening in the otherwise oppressive silence. The air smelled of decay, like the very earth around the prison had been contaminated by the secrets buried within. It was a place where hope went to die. The massive iron gates groaned open as the prison guards ushered him inside. They weren't friendly, but they weren't rude either, just stoic, as though they had long since learned not to question what went on within these walls. Henry followed them through the labyrinthine corridors, his steps echoing off the cold stone walls. The place was vast, much larger than he had imagined, with layers upon layers of cells, each one more decrepit than the last. The temperature dropped as they descended deeper into the heart of the prison, and Henry shivered involuntarily. They stopped at a large metal door, its surface covered in rust and grime. The guard unlocked it with a key that seemed far too old to still be in use, but the door creaked open with ease. Henry stepped inside. This was where the worst of the worst were kept, the solitary confinement block. The walls seemed to close in on him as soon as he entered, the darkness so absolute that he felt as though he were being swallowed whole. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the narrow hallways. "This is the last cell block," the guard said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Not many make it down here. Not many make it out either." Henry turned to look at the guard, but the man had already turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the oppressive silence. He swallowed hard and stepped further into the block, the air growing heavier with each step. There was something wrong about this place, a sense of unease that gnawed at his gut. It was as if the very walls were watching him. He paused at the first cell. It was empty, the bars stained with years of neglect. The rusting lock on the door hung loosely, as though it had been tampered with countless times. Henry couldn't help but wonder what kind of man had once occupied this space. But before he could think too long on it, a distant sound echoed down the hall, a faint scraping, like nails on stone. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He quickly turned his attention to the source of the noise, his flashlight flickering wildly. But there was nothing there, just the endless row of empty cells. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling of dread creeping up his spine. It was nothing, just his imagination. But as he walked further into the block, the feeling only intensified. The scraping sound continued, growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of nails on stone. It was something else, something far worse. He stopped at the second-to-last cell, the door slightly ajar. The air around it felt cold, unnaturally so. Henry hesitated. his hand trembling as he reached for the door. The moment his fingers touched the rusted metal, the scraping stopped. Silence fell over the prison like a heavy blanket. He pushed the door open. Inside, there was nothing. No prisoner. No bed. No furniture. Just a dark, empty room with nothing but a few scraps of old, torn clothing scattered on the floor. But what caught his attention was the walls. They were covered in markings, scratches, symbols, and strange drawings that seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural energy. The drawings were like nothing he had ever seen before. They looked almost alien. A series of spirals, jagged lines, and circles, as if someone had tried to map out something that couldn't be understood by the human mind. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer to examine the marks. As he moved closer, his flashlight flickered and then died, leaving him in complete darkness. And then he heard it. A low growl. It was so close, he could feel it reverberate in his chest. His blood ran cold as he fumbled for his backup flashlight, his hands shaking uncontrollably. As the light flickered back to life, he turned, but there was nothing behind him. But the growling continued. It was coming from below. Henry's heart raced. He turned to leave, but as he stepped toward the door, something caught his eye. It was a figure, a shadow, standing at the far end of the hall. For a split second, it looked human, but there was something wrong with it, something that made Henry's skin crawl. The figure slowly turned, revealing a face, twisted, gaunt, and disfigured. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth curled into a sickening grin. Henry's blood ran cold as the figure stepped forward, its footsteps echoing off the stone walls. He turned and ran, the growl growing louder behind him, but the creature was faster. He could hear it gaining on him. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against him from all sides as he sprinted down the narrow hallways. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get out, to escape the prison's suffocating grip. He rounded a corner, and nearly collided with a wall of iron bars. And then the growling stopped. Henry turned slowly, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature was gone, but the shadows lingered, swirling around him like a storm. The prison was alive. The darkness had a life of its own, and it was waiting for him to make his next move. Part 2: The Hollow Eyes. Henry's heart was pounding in his chest, his breath ragged as he pressed himself against the cold stone wall. The silence was oppressive, crushing him with its weight. His flashlight flickered again, casting eerie shadows along the narrow corridor. The shadows seemed to stretch, warping and shifting like living things. He had to get out of here. Now. But the moment he turned to flee, a voice, low, guttural, whispered from the darkness. "Not so fast." The words were incomprehensible, as if they were being spoken from the very walls themselves. His mind spun, and he found himself frozen, rooted to the spot. His eyes darted around, trying to find the source of the voice. But the corridor was empty, too empty. He couldn't see anything, yet he could feel something watching him. Then, from the depths of the shadows, something moved. It was slow at first, a figure, tall and thin, slinking out of the dark like a predator stalking its prey. Henry's blood ran cold as the shape came into view. The creature, if it could even be called that, was tall, too tall. Its limbs were elongated, thin and impossibly long, its skin as pale as death itself. Its face, if it could be called a face, was nothing but a twisted mockery of a human's. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, hollow sockets radiating an unnatural light. The thing smiled, its grin too wide to be human. It tilted its head to one side, its long fingers tapping against the wall in a rhythmic, maddening pattern. Henry stepped backward, but his legs felt like lead, weighed down by something unseen. His chest tightened, suffocating him. The growl, that low rumbling noise, filled his ears once again, coming from all around him. And then the voice returned, this time closer, too close. "You shouldn't have come here, Henry." The words sounded like a hiss, a breath drawn from the deepest pits of hell. Henry's skin crawled, his pulse racing as the creature took another step toward him. "No one ever leaves," it whispered, its voice filled with the hollow sound of lost souls. Henry's instincts kicked in. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let this thing get any closer. He spun around, his feet moving before he even thought, but the hallways twisted before him, like they were alive, shifting and turning. Every direction he ran in seemed to lead him back to the same place, the same stretch of empty, darkened corridors. His head spun with panic. The walls were closing in on him. The darkness itself was pressing in, swallowing everything whole. The creature's laugh echoed through the halls, a sound that sent ice through his veins. "You're lost," it taunted, its voice dripping with malice. "You'll never leave. This place is your grave now." Henry ran faster, his mind on the edge of madness. He could hear the creature's footsteps behind him, always just out of reach but closing in with every step. The walls seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the prison itself was alive, watching him, waiting. He rounded another corner, but this time, he wasn't alone. In the distance, he saw a figure, an inmate he thought at first. But as he drew closer, the figure's features became clearer, and his stomach churned. The man, or what had once been a man, was standing motionless at the end of the hall. His eyes were wide open, unblinking. There was no life in them, only an empty, hollow stare. His skin was drawn tight over his bones, pale and sickly. His mouth hung open, and from it, a thick, black substance dripped down onto the floor in a slow, viscous stream. The figure's body seemed to sway, as if caught in a gust of wind, though there was no wind in the prison. The man's eyes locked onto Henry, and for a moment, Henry swore he could feel the darkness from within those eyes trying to pull him in, to draw him into the depths of whatever hell this prison had become. Henry didn't stop. He couldn't. His feet carried him past the figure, but as he did, the man's eyes followed him, and the black substance on the floor seemed to shift, almost as if it were alive. He could hear the creature's footsteps again, faster this time, and the growling, the whispering, everything coming at him from all sides. The walls around him began to bend and twist in unnatural angles, the ceiling lowering, the floor rising. The prison was no longer a building. It was a living thing, and it was hungry. Suddenly, there was light ahead, real light, not the flickering glow of his flashlight. It beckoned him, a sliver of hope in the midst of the chaos. The end of the hall. The exit. Henry ran toward it, his heart pounding. But as he reached for the door, his hand slammed into the cold metal, and to his horror, the door didn't open. It was sealed shut. He slammed his fists against it, desperately trying to break it open, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the creature's growl intensified, and the voice, now louder than ever, whispered in his ear. Trapped. Forever. The growling turned into a shriek, and Henry turned to see the figure now standing in front of him, its long, bony hands reaching out toward him. The shadows from the walls twisted around the creature, forming tendrils that reached for his legs, pulling him into the darkness. His mind screamed for him to move, to fight, but it was as if his body no longer obeyed him. The darkness was suffocating, its grip tightening around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. As the creature's hands closed around him, he felt the cold, clammy touch of death. Not yet, it whispered. You haven't seen the truth yet. The truth of the prison. The world around Henry began to fade, the light from the door dimming as the darkness consumed him whole. His last breath was a gasp, a final plea for escape, but there was no escape. There would never be any escape. Part 3. The Truth Behind Bars. Henry's vision blurred. His body felt weightless, as though he were drifting, floating through the thick darkness that had swallowed him. He couldn't tell whether his eyes were open or shut. The darkness was so complete, it felt as though he had been blindfolded by the very air. Time seemed to lose its meaning, stretching and contracting like an elastic band. But then, slowly, a low humming sound began to fill his ears, a sound that resonated deep within his bones. The hum grew louder, more intense, until it felt as though the sound was coming from inside his head, vibrating through his skull. The darkness around him seemed to tremble in response, and for the briefest of moments, Henry thought he felt the faintest flicker of light. He blinked, and when his eyes opened, he wasn't in the hallways of Old Stone anymore. Instead, he found himself in a small, sterile room, its walls lined with cracked concrete. The faintest hint of sunlight filtered through a small, barred window near the ceiling. It was the kind of room reserved for solitary confinement, cold, isolated, and claustrophobic. Henry's breath hitched in his chest as he took in his surroundings. The room seemed too real, too vivid, yet everything about it felt off, like a twisted echo of reality. He tried to move, but his limbs were sluggish, as though they were weighed down by something unseen. In the far corner of the room, he saw it. A figure. A man, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. His head was tilted down, his hair matted and tangled, but it was the man's eyes that grabbed Henry's attention. Hollow, empty, like two black pits staring into the void. Henry felt a chill crawl down his spine, his blood turning to ice. The man's gaze lifted slowly, his head moving like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The eyes locked onto Henry's, and for a brief moment, the world around him seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them in this suffocating silence. Then the man spoke, his voice rasping as if he hadn't used it in years. "It's not over, you know," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "You've only just begun to understand." Henry opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, constricted, as if the air itself was thickening around him. The man's lips curled into a grin, an unsettling smile. "You think this place is just a prison?" the man continued, his eyes never leaving Henry's. "A place to lock away the worst of humanity. But what you don't understand, what no one understands, is that this prison, Old Stone, it was never just a place for criminals. It was built to contain something much older, much more dangerous." Henry's heart pounded in his chest. The creature, the growling, the twisted shadows, it was all connected. This prison had always been more than just a building. It was a barrier, a prison for something far more sinister. "What are you talking about?" Henry finally managed to rasp, his voice weak. "What's in here?" The man's smile widened, his eyes glinting with a madness Henry couldn't comprehend. "You're not the first to ask that question," he said softly. "And you won't be the last." The man's form seemed to shimmer, his features warping like a reflection in disturbed water. The walls of the room began to ripple, the cracks in the concrete widening and splitting open, revealing endless darkness beyond. The room was no longer a cell. It was part of something much larger, much more terrifying. Henry's senses spun as the very fabric of reality seemed to tear around him. The man's voice came again, echoing as if it were coming from every direction at once. "They were always here, Henry," the voice said, growing louder with each word. "The inmates? The guards? They were never just people. They were vessels. Tools. This prison was built to house something that has existed for centuries, something that was bound by blood and bone, by suffering and fear. But the chains are weakening. Henry felt his stomach churn, nausea rising in his throat as the walls of the room collapsed entirely, revealing a vast expanse of twisted, writhing shadows. A new figure appeared, larger than the man, towering and monstrous. The creature was an amalgamation of nightmares, its limbs long and bent at unnatural angles, its skin a sickly, decaying green. Its face was a grotesque mockery of humanity, its mouth split wide into a jagged grin, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. The creature's eyes were black voids, infinite and empty. This, the man's voice whispered, is what was imprisoned here. The creature stepped forward, its enormous claws dragging across the ground, sending a ripple of pure terror through Henry's body. His heart raced, each beat echoing in his ears like thunder. "What is it?" Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. The man's grin widened, revealing sharp, rotting teeth. "It is the prison's true purpose. The thing that fed on fear, on pain. It was bound here by rituals older than civilization itself. But now it is awake." Henry's mind reeled, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The creature in front of him was real. It was ancient, predatory, and it was coming closer. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The air around him grew thick with darkness, suffocating him, pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the creature's hand shot out, its long, talon-like fingers wrapping around Henry's throat. The crushing pressure was unbearable as it lifted him off the ground. His vision blurred, and the room around him began to spin. "You wanted to know the truth." The creature's voice rasped, its words a sickening hiss. "Now you'll be part of it." The creature's eyes flashed, and the darkness seemed to engulf Henry. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void, his consciousness slipping away like a dying ember in the wind. Henry awoke with a violent gasp. His body was trembling, drenched in cold sweat. He was no longer in the sterile room or in the grasp of the creature. He was back in the corridors of Old Stone, his flashlight flickering weakly in his hand. His breath came in ragged gasps, the fear still clinging to him like a shadow. But something had changed. The walls of the prison seemed to breathe, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The air felt heavy with malice, as though the very building was alive, aware of his presence. Henry's mind was reeling from the vision, no, the nightmare, he had just experienced. He didn't know what was real anymore. Had it been a hallucination? A twisted dream? He didn't have time to think. The growling sound returned, but this time it was louder, closer. The creature was coming for him, and this time, he didn't have the luxury of doubt. There was no escaping the prison now. The darkness had already claimed him. Part 4. The Hollow Prison. The growl came again, deep and guttural, resonating through the walls. Henry's heart thundered in his chest as the darkness around him seemed to deepen, the oppressive weight of it pressing against his ribs. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but the shadows danced and swirled, mocking his every movement. The air grew thicker. The walls, once solid and unmoving, now seemed alive, bending, warping, as if the entire prison was breathing. It was a sensation Henry couldn't shake, like the building itself had become sentient, and was aware of his every step. He had to get out. He had to escape. But where could he go? Every hallway led to the same place. Every corner turn brought him back to the beginning. The shadows weren't just following him. They were guiding him, pulling him towards something, towards someone. As he stumbled down the corridor, his flashlight flickering weakly, a faint whisper drifted through the air. His blood ran cold as the voice spoke again, just like before, low and rasping. "You can't leave, Henry. Not now. Not ever. He stopped dead in his tracks. The voice. It was so familiar, but there was something wrong with it. The cold, unnatural tone made his skin crawl, and yet it sounded almost like a part of him. Something he couldn't escape, something that wanted him to stay. Henry whipped around, but the hallway remained empty. No shadowy figures. No monstrous creatures. Just the suffocating, oppressive silence of the prison. The whispers grew louder. You think you're free, but this place never lets go. It's in your blood, Henry. It always has been. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind him, slow and deliberate. Henry's pulse quickened. His legs felt like lead, but somehow, he managed to force himself to move, his body propelled by pure instinct. But the footsteps continued to follow, getting closer with every passing second. Let go, Henry. The voice was now unmistakable, a cold, mocking version of his own, twisted by something dark and ancient. It felt as if the prison had taken root inside of him, its malevolent grip tightening around his soul. The whispers from the walls, the growls of the creature that haunted the corridors, it was all becoming too much. He was being suffocated by the very air around him. There was no escape. And then, he saw it. The doorway at the end of the hall, bathed in the faint, sickly light of his dying flashlight. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like salvation. But as Henry ran toward it, the shadows coiled around him like tendrils, tugging at his feet, pulling him backward. No, no! He shouted, struggling against the invisible grip that threatened to drag him into the depths of the prison. He reached the door, barely, and threw himself through it, slamming it shut behind him. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. The darkness seemed to recede, and Henry's breath was the only sound that filled the space around him. He had escaped, for now. His chest heaved with each gasping breath as he pressed his back to the door, sweat dripping from his brow. But as he slowly turned around, his eyes widened in horror. The room was not empty. Standing before him was the man, no, the thing, from before. The one with the hollow, black eyes, the twisted grin. You really thought you could run? It whispered, its voice a hollow echo of its former self. Henry's heart dropped into his stomach. He backed away, but there was no room to retreat. The figure took a slow step forward, its long, bony fingers stretching toward him. The air felt thick and oppressive, choking the life out of him with every breath. The figure's grin widened as it stepped closer, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, yellow teeth. Henry's mind screamed. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run. And then, as if from nowhere, a new sound filled the room. A laugh. It was low, drawn out, almost melodic, a laughter that sent a chill straight down his spine. The figure stopped moving, its head jerking toward the source of the noise. The laugh came again, this time louder, more sinister, as if it were circling him, surrounding him, closing in. Another figure emerged from the shadows. It was human? Henry blinked in disbelief. The new figure was tall, lean, wearing a faded prison uniform, and yet there was something about him that was off. His face was too pale, his eyes too dark, and the twisted grin he wore was far too wide to be natural. He stepped forward with a fluid grace, his every movement sending a wave of terror crashing through Henry's chest. Now, the figure said, his voice almost too sweet. You think you can escape what's coming for you, Henry? You think you can outrun this place? He chuckled darkly, his eyes glinting with malice. This prison, it feeds on your fear. It knows your deepest, darkest secrets. And it's alive, Henry. It's alive. The figure's words echoed in Henry's mind as the room around him seemed to close in once again. The walls, the shadows, the growling, It was all part of the prison's game, a game Henry had no chance of winning. He was in too deep. The thing that haunted Old Stone, its true nature, was far worse than he could ever have imagined. "You'll never leave." The figure continued, stepping closer, its voice now a hiss. "Because it knows you. It knows all of us. Those who come here, who stay too long, become a part of it. A part of the prison. It absorbs you." Henry's mind reeled. The creature, the darkness, it wasn't just some supernatural force that haunted the prison. It was the prison. It was the foundation, the heart of Old Stone, and anyone who entered became a piece of its unholy architecture. Henry's legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. His breath was ragged, his body trembling in terror. There was no way out. No escape. He had been drawn into the prison's grip long before he ever stepped inside. As the figures closed in, their hollow eyes watching him with twisted amusement, Henry felt the weight of his fate crashing down on him. And then, the ground beneath him began to shake. The walls cracked, and the ceiling groaned as the prison itself began to tremble, as if it were waking from a long slumber. The very earth beneath Old Stone stirred, shifting, reshaping. It was no longer just a prison. It was a living, breathing thing. And it was hungry. Part 5. The Last Prisoner. The ground shook beneath Henry's feet, the trembling so violent that he was thrown to the floor, his head slamming against the cold concrete. Pain exploded in his skull, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. The walls of the room groaned, as if the very prison itself were alive, and something within it was stirring. Something ancient. Something hungry. The figures in front of him didn't move. Their hollow, black eyes seemed to glimmer with excitement, as though they had been waiting for this moment. The prison itself was coming alive. "You think you can escape the hunger?" the figure who had been speaking earlier asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "You were never meant to. You never stood a chance, Henry. This place takes what it wants. And you're part of it now." The laugh came again, low and deep, vibrating through the floor beneath him. Henry scrambled to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears, but the darkness was closing in from all sides. The air was thick with a suffocating, oppressive force. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, pulsating with a life of their own. He wanted to scream, but the breath wouldn't come. His throat was dry, choked with fear. The walls twisted, and the ground beneath him cracked wide open, splitting like a wound on the surface of the earth. A deep, resonating rumble filled the air as the entire prison seemed to shift, its foundations trembling as if it were breathing. The ceiling above him cracked open, revealing a black void that stretched beyond anything Henry could comprehend. And then, in the distance, he heard it. A deep, guttural growl, low and rumbling, like something ancient awakening from a long slumber. The sound reverberated through the prison, vibrating the air and rattling the walls. Henry's chest tightened. He could feel the prison's heartbeat, and it was growing louder. Closer. "It's waking," the figure whispered, his grin widening. "And you'll be the first to feel its hunger." Henry's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the prison had its grip on him, pulling him in deeper, deeper into the heart of the darkness. The ground beneath him gave way completely, and he plunged into the abyss, falling through the hole that had opened up in the floor. He fell through the darkness, the air rushing past him in a cold, suffocating wave. His body slammed against something, stone, flesh, bone, and then everything went black. When Henry awoke, he was no longer in the prison. He was somewhere else. Somewhere darker. His head throbbed, and his body ached. But as he slowly opened his eyes, he realized he wasn't alone. Around him stood a circle of figures, their faces obscured by shadows. They were all wearing the same faded prison uniforms, their bodies gaunt and twisted, their eyes hollow and empty. But what stood out the most were the marks on their skin, strange, glowing symbols, each one different, but all seemingly linked to one another in an intricate web. Henry tried to move, but his limbs were paralyzed, his body unresponsive. He couldn't speak, couldn't scream. He could only watch in horror as the figures stepped forward, their hollow eyes locked onto his. "You're here now," one of the figures whispered, his voice raspy and distant. "The prison has claimed you." The air around Henry grew colder, and the symbols on the figure's skin began to pulse with an eerie light. It was as if they were drawing from some invisible source of power, a force that Henry couldn't understand. "Old Stone is not just a prison," another figure spoke, its voice deep and resonating with a power that shook the very air. "It is the heart of something much greater, a living entity, bound by rituals and blood. It is an eternal prison for the souls that are foolish enough to come here." Henry's heart hammered in his chest as the realization dawned on him. The prison was not just a structure, it was a being, a creature that fed on the lives of those trapped within it. The darkness, the growling, the whispers, it wasn't just a haunting. It was a parasite, a force that had consumed the prison and everything inside it. The figures around him began to chant in a low, guttural language, words that Henry couldn't understand, but somehow felt deep in his bones. The symbols on their skin began to glow brighter, and the room around him seemed to warp, the walls shifting like the surface of a liquid. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot, and Henry could feel the ground beneath him begin to tremble. "You're the last one," the figure closest to him whispered, its eyes glinting with something dark. "The final soul needed to complete the ritual. The prison has awoken, and now, it will take everything." Henry's vision began to blur. He could hear the growling again, but this time, it was different. It was closer, almost as though it was inside his mind. The darkness crept in from all sides, suffocating him, and he could feel the tendrils of the prison's hunger closing around his soul. He tried to scream, tried to break free, but there was no escape. The prison had him now, its grip tightening like a vice. He was part of it, just another prisoner caught in the endless cycle of torment. And then, a new sound filled the air. A voice. It was a whisper at first, soft and distant, but it grew louder, clearer. "Asterisk Henry, asterisk." He turned, his heart racing, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure in the distance. A man. A face that was both familiar and foreign. His father? His brother? Someone from his past? But the figure was moving toward him, and as it drew closer, its face twisted, its features warped by something darker, something more primal. "No," Henry whispered. "Please." But the figure reached out, its hands cold as death itself, and as it touched him, Henry felt his soul rip from his body. The darkness enveloped him, consumed him whole. When Henry opened his eyes again, there was nothing. No light. No sound. Just an endless void. He was trapped in the darkness forever. Old Stone had claimed him. The end.